It's a grandiose title that Sue has given me to speak to, but in fact I want to range across a number of subjects, one after the other. Firstly, to say something about the changing world. Now, you could talk endlessly about that, but just a couple of aspects of it that strike me as particular interest. I'll say something about the Indian Ocean, and something about India, a bit about West Asia generally, a bit about Afghanistan, and then I think you'd be interested a little in what I'd have to say about the work I'm doing for the government in Canberra on the Force Posture Review, which is the matter of where the Australian Defence Force should be postured or located around Australia. But I hope to say just enough about each of those subjects to provoke the sort of questions that will fill out the gaps. To speak firstly, though, about the changing world, there's just so much to say about it in terms of the transfer of power from economic power and influence and thus other forms of power from the North Atlantic to Asia and now beyond to South America and to Africa. There's so much to be said about all of that, and some of it I'll be saying at the AIIA tomorrow night. But I'd make 2 points here. One is the scale of this change is unprecedented in world affairs. The Industrial Revolution, with all of its ramifications, was essentially confined to Europe and then reached out to the rest of the world. The Asia Revolution has reached out to the whole world almost simultaneously to its development in Asia. And consider the scale of it. The Industrial Revolution in Great Britain took place on the basis, firstly, of one great piece of engineering, the steam engine and things that followed from that, and secondly, to a population of 18 million. The transformation that is running in Asia, in China alone, of course, embraces 1.5 billion people, and it's on the seriously, genuinely transformative technology of communications technology, and the amplification of that is just so much greater for the world than even the Industrial Revolution was, with this caveat that the Industrial Revolution in Europe was accompanied by political change, revolution on the continent, very clever, pragmatic evolution in Great Britain as the development of the parliamentary system. And it was that political change that enabled the Industrial Revolution. For most of Asia, certainly for China, the political evolution has not yet come. Some say it doesn't have to come. Some Chinese would say we're different, we don't need political change, but others are worrying greatly about it, as those of you who followed the discussion, the debate in the National People's Congress earlier this month would be aware just what the destiny of China is as a political entity remains unresolved and a matter of great interest to us all. I would just leave you with this thought, that China's success has transformed this part of the world, indeed much of the world. China's failure would have even greater consequences. I'll leave you with this point too. We tend to talk about change on that sort of scale, but it's reaching right down into the way in which international institutions are being run. Now, in 1945 and the years that followed, when the UN system was set up and the Bretton Woods system of the IMF and the World Bank and so on, deals were done, arrangements were put in place which suited the Western model. They suited us, the UK, the US, and all of those in that camp, essentially. For instance, the IMF managing director was always going to be a European. The World Bank president was always going to be American. And Europe and America made their decisions and they told the rest of us what was happening. That's coming to an end. I think Christine Lagarde will be the last European to run, to be managing director of the IMF. Probably Dominic Strauss-Kahn should have been. Probably the Mexican candidate for whom we supported should have got up. But Christine Lagarde is there for now. In the World Bank, Bob Zelik's time as president is coming to an end. The new appointee will be an American, but the developing world is not waiting for the United States to make a decision. It's trying to tell the United States who that person should be. In the bodies themselves, in the committees of the UN, the rules that worked so well for us for 60 years are being rewritten and reworked by the new democratic world. We're going to get much less of our way in the future in those organisations we've had in the past. I suppose you needn't go so far as to say that it will all go the way of International Cricket Council, which of course is now dominated by the power and money of India and produces results which not all of us are comfortable with. But I would just say that there will be change and it will be a different world for us. Is that a civilizational change? Some people are saying, well, that means that all those rules of transparency and good governance and accountability to which we've attached such importance, not only in international institutions, but in companies and private sector organisations, will be discarded in favour of more opaque ways of operating. Well, I don't regard that as a civilizational change, but I do regard it in my limited and prosaic way as a challenge to be managed, and has to be managed by serious policy applications by our governments. I'm not saying that we are forever in the declining camp of the Western world, but I am saying that the Western consensus still suits us best, and we'll have to work very hard to get the best out of what remains of it. Let me move on to the Indian Ocean. Of course, as a West Australian, I'm much aware of what importance we've attached to the Indian Ocean for many, many years, since 1826, and the rest of the world, in a sense, is catching up. I'm old enough also to remember that Gordon Freeth, a coalition government foreign minister, external affairs minister he would have been called, was defeated in his electorate of Forest in 1969 when he made a very contentious speech about the Indian Ocean, arguing that we needn't really have anything to fear from the Soviet Union in the Indian Ocean. It was far too far away from any area of critical interest to them. An outfit called the League of Rights targeted Freeth in his electorate of Forest, and he was defeated. That's 1969. And I remember, of course, as many of you would, in the 80s when Kim Beazley put the Indian Ocean back on the national agenda briefly, but it didn't get a lot of traction. Well, now it's back again, and it's getting traction. I think that it's sometimes overstated. I think many of you will be aware of Robert Kaplan's work arguing that the Indian Ocean is going to be in the future, as the Pacific has been in the past, a strategic crucible in world affairs. I don't see it quite that way. It will be important, but for quite different reasons than the Pacific was important. It will be important really for 4 reasons, and I think they have to be dealt with one at a time rather than holistically. Firstly, enormous amount of the world's resources and energy trade goes through the Indian Ocean, but it actually goes through particular sea lanes for which there are 4, possibly 5 choke points, and it's the managing of those sea lanes and the choke points which is the strategic issue of great importance. I think that can be done. There isn't any particular reason for great powers to confront each other over the operation of those sea lanes. They have a shared interest in them remaining open and available to all. A second reason for the importance, of course, is that when you talk Indian Ocean in very great deal of sense, you're talking about the Persian Gulf, with all of its economic issues of energy supply as well as its political issues. Thirdly, the Indian Ocean is often an analogy, as it were, for failed states, the failed states on its border, Somalia, and failing states, some might say Pakistan, which give rise to those issues of piracy, which are a separate matter again to be dealt with. And then fourthly, the Indian Ocean is important because of the resources that are in the seabed and the resources in the sea. And there are at present no internationally agreed operating rules for the exploitation of those resources, another very big issue that we'll have to address in the future. Each of those 4 reasons that I break the Indian Ocean into has a very considerable importance in its own right, but to manage it as one strategic entity, as a sense we've approached the Pacific in the past, I think is not quite there. Turning to India, again, a great attachment in Western Australia. We recall, many of us, when the University of Western Australia had a first-rate school of Indian studies and history. My wife studied Indian history there for a couple of years. People like Peter Reeve were distinguished international scholars of the Indian Ocean. I would hope for a day when that kind of distinction can be returned, but it fell away for some years for reasons of university resourcing, I suppose. India, is it going to be the world's next superpower, next great power? I'm a skeptic on this, a lover of India myself. I can see India being a great economy, but a great power in terms of influencing others, in terms of pulling the levers in world affairs. I'm not convinced yet of that. It is possible to be a great economy, of course, without exercising great influence, as Japan was. Now, Japan came with particular baggage. India, in a sense, comes not with baggage, but with conditions of its own about the nature of its government and the way it is likely to be governed into the next generation, much the same as it is now. Healthily democratic, but inhibited, nevertheless, in the development of a genuinely strategic sense of power. But that said, India for us in Australia, and particularly for Western Australia, obviously is going to be of enormous economic and wider significance. And I think that the breakthroughs of the last few years, and particularly, of course, since India has crossed the divide, has come from the wrong side of history to what we would regard as the right side of history, just make the relationship so much more possible to do with. We battled for many years to find the basis of that relationship with India, but as I've suggested, we were essentially on the wrong side of a divide. We committed to the United States, India committed to what it was pleased to call non-alignment, which sets aside the treaty they signed with the Soviet Union, of course, in 1971, but nevertheless on the other side, as it were. And is a different kind of economy, a closed and subsidised, a state-supported economy, and we had moved earlier to being an open market-driven economy. Now all that changed in 1990 and 91. India has, as I said, crossed the divide, and with that comes the development of India and the development of more natural kind of relationship for us. And so we have great aspirations for that, recognising still that I think there is a challenge in causing Indian leadership to look as favourably on Australia yet as we might look on India. West Asia is another matter. You know, in Australia for a couple of generations we've been obsessing about East Asia and its development, and on the one hand we've seen the enormous economic growth beginning with Japan running through Korea, Taiwan into China and now into Vietnam and so on, and at the same time we've had a parallel obsession with security issues arising in East Asia, the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, South China Sea and so on. The fact is this, that over the last 30 plus years barely a shot has been fired in anger east of Bombay. The great conflicts of the last generation have occurred between Bombay, Mumbai and Beirut. Now, yes, there's been some incidents in East Asia, but nothing of a strategic consequence. But what has happened between Mumbai and Beirut has shaped the last generation in world affairs. And what a region it is. I call it a nightmare region. Two bookends, Kashmir and Palestine, Israel. Two creations of the immediate post-Second World War era, with unfinished business that nearly 70 years on remains unfinished. And although we could sit down in class and devise solutions to Kashmir and Israel-Palestine, nobody has yet devised one which is politically acceptable for either and works. In the middle of this bookshelf, Iran. A manageable, positive force in a way in global affairs through till 1978. Since then, the rift with the United States, the radicalisation of Iran, has opened up the most severe chasm in world affairs of the lifetime of most of us. We worked our way through the rift of the Cold War, but there's no end in sight that I can see to the rift between Iran and the United States and Iran and the West, and that defines what happens in this nightmare region. On either side of Iran, Iraq and Syria on one side, Afghanistan and Pakistan on the other. this is an area in which, over the last generation, the great issues of our time have manifested. Of course, terrorism, and if you believe in the civilization conflict, that reflects then that too. The great nuclear proliferation issues of our time are there with Pakistan and Iran and Israel, and the great energy issues that are likely to preoccupy us in the future are there too, as well as the changes that are occurring month by month and year by year, in particular through what is being called the Arab Spring. This area will preoccupy us in world affairs for many years to come. Our stake in this in Australia, of course, is a global issue of peace and energy supply and all the rest of it, global issue of proliferation, but a very tangible issue, and especially for people here in Perth because of our economic relationships and interests in the Gulf states, which feel themselves in a very precarious situation in that world that I describe. Afghanistan, let me say that everything I say here, except in regard to Afghanistan and force posture, is me speaking, not the government. I work for the government in two capacities, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and force posture. And so I'll move on to Afghanistan, as it were, in my government hat. I am what is called the Special Envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's a creation of an American diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, who back in 2009, after the Obama administration came to office, took the view in shorthand that Afghanistan was much too much as a policy issue in the hands of defence ministries and defence forces around the world, that the solution to Afghanistan, if there was one, would in the end have to be a political solution. There was not a military solution available in itself, and that it was necessary to build foreign ministries and civilian areas of government much more into policy making than had been the case in the first 7 or 8 years of the Afghan war. And so he encouraged like-minded governments to appoint these special envoy characters. Now, some of them appointed full-time people. Our government went to the adjustment paddock and pulled out a retired horse and gave it another gallop. And it's been, interesting, demanding, and all the rest of it. But have we made a difference? Well, you reach a conclusion here when I've spoken. But I think that everything you read about Afghanistan is right. It is a gloomy picture in so many ways. We've been there, international forces, for 10.5 years, and we've made a lot of progress on the security front. ISAF forces, which incidentally represent 50 nations of the world, 50, the single biggest coalition operation ever put together, and with a complete UN Security Council mandate, not something tricked up like Iraq. So they've made good progress, but will it be sustained after those forces leave? That is the question. Thank you. That's the big focus at the present time, because, as you know, the intention is to withdraw international forces, ISAF forces, from their combat role by the end of 2014. In effect, it will happen earlier, though, from about the end of 2013 onwards, perhaps the middle of 2013. The international forces will be there in a support role, training, mentoring, escorting Afghan forces into the field, but the Afghan forces will take the security lead. That should help them evolve into a force that can hold the territory that has been won, but that remains, of course, to be tested. I think 2 points to make about all of this. Afghanistan, and this is sometimes overlooked, and of course, I am in the glass half full business, but Afghanistan, whatever happens, won't go back to being what it was in 2001. And there are lots of reasons for that. They've built a ring road around the country, and there's just a lot more infrastructure than there ever was. But there's interesting things like 40 radio and television stations, 80 newspapers, There are something like 8 million mobile telephones in use in Afghanistan, and I don't know how many computers, but you go into all sorts of obscure places and find bearded and turbaned gentlemen using laptops. You know, there's an opening of the lights-on sense that is very different from 2010, and there are a third of the people in Parliament are women. There are a couple of million women at schools. It's very hard to turn off those lights, to turn it back. That's not to say that the thing is going to prove an unmitigated success, but it is to say that it can't go back to what it was. And of course, I think that Al-Qaeda, which is the original purpose of international forces going there, has suffered a strategic defeat. The second thing to say about Afghanistan, as I said before, the international military commitment will change. Forces will be run down. There's about 100,000 foreign military forces there now. They will be run down. Most will be gone by the end of 2014, but not all. Some will stay on in a training role, and it's possible that some will stay on as special forces to take on Al-Qaeda-like cells where they emerge. That's yet to be defined. But the important thing is that the international commitment to Afghanistan will remain. What happened in 1992, well, the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, and they left Najibullah there with a reasonable sized armed force of about 67,000, and they held the Taliban at bay for all of that time. But in 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Soviet funding for the Afghan security forces was stopped, and with that the security forces folded, civil war opened up, and the Taliban succeeded. What we have to do this time is ensure that the force we leave is competent, well led, capable, etc., and continues to be funded and continues to hold as much as possible of what has been won. So, as they're saying, reversing the narrative of Najibullah is what remains for ISAF and the NATO forces. Finally, let me say something about the force posture review work, because that, I think, has some interest and implications for you here in Western Australia. Force posture is, not about telling the army to stand up straight and take off their slouch hats and put straight up hats on. It's not that kind of posture. Posture is military argot for where the force is around the country. And it can relate to bases and home ports and airfields, to physical assets, and it can relate as well to where the force operates and how it moves around the country. And we've dealt with it in both of those senses. For historic reasons, but also for strategic reasons, the most significant military bases in Australia are in southern Australia. Of course, here at Stirling is Fleet Base West, where a third of the fleet is based, or will be. And in the east you have everything from Townsville down the coast to Sydney Harbour and Puckapunyal and Cerberus and Edinburgh and so on, and Amberley and Williamtown. In the north we have relatively little. Tyndall Air Base, some bare bases at Curtin, Learmonth, Sherga, and a sort of forward operating base for both Air Force and Navy, but in a limited way at Darwin. Question that the government asked us was, and this question had not been asked since 1987, question they asked was, 25 years on, the movement of our economic activity northwards, the growth in numbers of people in the north, the change in capabilities, military capabilities of countries to the north of us, how had these factors impacted on our force posture? Did we need to change anything? Some of you might have seen a progress report that we did, and I know from reading the Senate estimates, Senator Eggleston, that you spoke on this subject during estimates. But the progress report said, look, we need to do a little bit at Stirling, including, and I've no hesitation in putting this recommendation out there, promoting the most senior person there to be an admiral. I think it's not unreasonable that a third of the continent, a third of the fleet should have an admiral in charge. With all the admirals in Sydney Harbour, one might come here. Opening a forward operating base for Navy, something smallish, but something they can get in and out of quickly for fuel and supplies and crew changeover at Broome. We think is probably the best place for reasons I can talk about if you're interested, and a little bit of development work at Darwin. The most contentious recommendation, if you're in Eastern Australia, is of course the notion that, hey, you won't have most of the Australian fleet in Sydney Harbour a generation from now. Some of it, yes, but it's time to start moving out. Question is to where? This is a hard question, as Dave will know. You, as a master mariner, you sail out of Sydney Harbour, you turn left, go north, you go anti-clockwise around Australia. The next decent port you get to, the next natural harbour, is King George Sound. Between Sydney and around the north and down the west coast, the rest of our harbours are lurking behind islands or in river mouths, and Stirling is one of the better examples of how it works, but they're not great natural harbours. But more importantly, we don't need to posture the Navy all that farther north in terms of home ports. They need to be able to operate out there, but they don't need to be there. So those couple of specific recommendations, but more broadly we're saying Navy, Army, Air Force have to get used to operating in the north again. They used to do more than they do. I'm concerned, we're a little concerned now that they need to refamiliarise themselves with what is happening in northern Australia. They need to put naval patrols through the oil and gas fields periodically, not because anybody's suggesting they're threatened, but rather because there's billions of dollars of Australian and international investment there, and there are thousands of vessels passing through there every month. We need to be able to say, this is Australia, we care about this, and we're capable of looking after it. That's enough for this stage. And it may be patrol boats, it may be frigates, it may be ships en route somewhere else, but they just pass through that area. They also have to, I think, habituate themselves to these new harbours. I was in Port Hedland last week, and it's just astonishing. There were 10 Cape-class ships in a harbour. Cape-class is 200,000 plus, 150,000 plus, but these were all 200,000 tonners and 48 out to sea. And it's a huge harbour. Navy in the past would have said tidal movements are too great, not an easy port to operate in and out of, but now there is no time during the day when the biggest ship in this Royal Australian Navy could not go in or out of Port Hedland, and I think we just need to encourage them to do that more often. In many ways, the infrastructure development in the north is a challenge to the Australian Defence Force because they used to be the only game in town, and now the resource companies and the harbour masters will say, well, the Navy's welcome, but they'll have to take their place in the queue. And by the way, the Chinese ore carriers pay for their berth space and the Navy doesn't. So if you have to wait a while in the queue, please understand. It's a much more competitive environment. It's competitive in this way too, and this is what really fascinated me, that in a sense government is on, or has placed itself on, the wrong side of the divide in the two-speed economy. On the one side of it, you've got resource companies, private companies booming along. On the other side of it, you've got government unable or unwilling to spend, desperate to stay in surplus, so not putting money out there, and thus not keeping up. A practical example of this, if we wanted to extend a wharf in, I don't know, Dampier or somewhere else, and it costs $60 million, that would go to the federal cabinet, and it would go to the Parliamentary Works Committee, $60 million, maybe $100 million would, and it would take 1.5 years to 2 years. Woodside, the Chief Finance Officer at the wharf, has that delegation, and he could do it next week. Now, you don't want government to be any different. You'd be concerned about what was happening to your money. But it does mean that the speed and the scale at which things are happening is a scale at which government is not there. And you can see that in development of schools, medical clinics and so on. And the Defence Force, as I said, faces that issue. It's not no longer the only game in town, it's a marginal game in town. That they see as a challenge. My point to them is that this is an opportunity because the facilities are being built for you. Get in there and use them. The last thing about force posture is simply this, that if we're going to make best use of the big ships that the Royal Australian Navy is getting and the new generation aircraft, the KC-30 tankers and the Wedgetails and the P-8 surveillance aircraft. Every one of these things is bigger than what it's replacing. And so the airfields need to be longer and stronger and wider. The fuel storage dumps need to be bigger. The wharves need to be bigger. The harbours need to be dredged deeper. There's a very big bill potentially at the end of this, as we indicated in our progress report. Anyway, we're going to conclude that report in the next few weeks, and we'll go to government, and they will feed that into the next white paper, Defence White Paper, which is to be completed in 2014. And if our recommendations are taken seriously, I would think that the effect could be to shape defence spending away from acquisition of new platforms, most of which we've got for the next generation now or coming on stream, and towards the catch-up of facilities, especially in the north, which will enable those assets to operate more easily in the north. So, Sue, Michael, that's as much as I want to say. I'm sorry if it's been a jerky kind of failed segue from one subject to another, but I really wanted to cover a number of separate matters that I thought would be of interest here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Now, it's over to you. We are recording this, so we have a microphone. So if you want to speak, put up your hand, will you? And Ian, sorry. The lady with the microphone will then come this way. I'm sorry, what's your name? Colleen, sorry.
Come towards Albany.
Yeah.
Not Darwin. I was listening, Rick. Yeah, Rick, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I could ask you things about pretty much every area you spoke about. But I'm quite interested in the forced posture and also the almost side remark you made about keeping the budget in surplus, because it seems to me it's a balancing act in which you've really only got one leg to stand on. Well, it's not your leg anyway, but it's the government's got to deal with it. And in a sense, both sides of politics have adopted this, we're going to be in surplus and stay in surplus. But it's almost like you're making a case, and I'm sure you're not politically charged to do this, but to say, if you want to have a surplus, but don't include defence in that. Say you can, in a sense, quarantine defence out of that. It's too important to be held back by a political notion of keeping the budget in surplus. Now, there's a real danger in that, of course, and that's the political commentators will say, oh, you're letting those people in defence buy anything they want if you do that. But I think there's enough people watching that now that defence would think they've got to be a little careful. But is there a case to be made for quarantining defence out of the whole surplus notion so that we can get on with the infrastructure that you've made such an eloquent case for?
Ouch. You've led me into a minefield here. It's not for me to comment on the macro economics of government in this. I just found this notion of there being two sides of the divide a fascinating one, and I think the social and political consequences of it quite considerable. As to defence, certainly the defence establishment would love the notion you suggest, and they would say we're in a unique situation. No other government in the world is responsible for the defence of an entire continent of its own. We're trying to do something that nobody else is doing in the world, and we're trying to do it on 1.9% of GDP, and that's very, very difficult to do. So they would make a kind of case for a great deal more money. But of course so would the welfare sector, and so would the health sector, and so would the education sector. That's the thing. That's what government has got to juggle. The point that I come to in all of this is that simply putting out government spending might not be the only way in the future, because the infrastructure is being laid down in a way for the Defence Force. It could use nobody else but Defence uses Tyndall or Learmonth. But, Port Hedland Airport is big and growing, and I don't know the lengths and breadths, so I can't say off the top of my head what US Air Force could make of it, but it could certainly use it. It's a big airfield, and Port Hedland Harbour, as I said, 25 years ago when the last review was done, they wouldn't have contemplated going in there in anything other than a patrol boat, but now it could take every ship we've got. So I'll be encouraging Defence to think of using the infrastructure that's put in place for other reasons, and that's what struck me about in a sort of governance sense about the way Northwest is working now. Senator Eggleson was saying that when he was mayor of Port Hedland, the budget of the Port Hedland Town Council was $15 million. They told me on Friday it's now $146 million. And they draw on sources for this that they couldn't draw on before. Obviously the royalties for regions money, but a lot of money from BHP, which didn't used to come. BHP is building a Donga township for 4,000 workers, and in return for providing land for that, Port Hedland Council will get $40 million and they'll put it into town amenities. So it's just a different model for drawing on government money. Now, Defence won't be able to do quite those sort of deals, but it'll have to use it to use opportunities that others are putting in place. I haven't answered your question, and I'm not going to beyond that.
Other questions of Rick? Senator Eggleson.
Looking at our relationship with the Asian area and China in particular, and people are concerned throughout Asia about the growing economic power of China and its influence on the region. What scope do you think there is for the ASEAN group, which has a population in total of about 600 million people, I think, to act as a buffer between the rest of Southeast Asia and maybe West Asia and countries like Australia, and become a partner in sort of it to some degree, sort of containing China a little bit and sort of ensuring that there's another layer of countries there who might join us in perhaps preserving our economic independence and also our right to be able to make our own decisions about things that happen in the area.
Yeah, I think there is certainly is scope for that. I'm very cautious about using the word containment because that had a particular meaning in the Soviet in the Cold War context, which is not the way in which we have to manage the rise of China. But you're quite right. What we have an interest in seeing is a number of alternative centres of power and weight. They mightn't be in any one case the equal of China, but as long as each is robust, then we can put in place a working system for managing the giant in the room. ASEAN, interestingly, of course, began in quite different circumstances back in the late 60s, and it's evolved now into several different roles. I think the challenge for ASEAN still is very much to get its own act together, but as one of the sources of regional power, I think ASEAN, particularly now that Indonesia is on the road to recovery, can play something of that role. And there's Japan. I mean, it's not as though there are slight countries out there, all of them engaged and responding to the rise of China. Japan was the world's second largest economy, is what now the third or fourth something, and will remain large for all its torpor. Korea, a very substantial country of its own kind. Vietnam as a member of ASEAN, yes, and India. I don't think you would back any one of these countries to be your single counterweight to China, but as a collective, we all have an interest in ensuring that China's power is exercised in ways that we can live with. And for the most part, it is. China understands that game as well as anybody does, but it's still got some way to go.
Thank you. And thank you, Rick. Very interesting. You spoke about the way that multilateralism is changing as well and Australia's place in that. Could you make comment on the role of the BRIC countries?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a very interesting
Yeah, no,
development.
it is indeed. You're right. And when I talked earlier about power shifting to the new emerging countries, there are two code words for them: BRICS or ISBAs. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and those that follow. And ISBA is India, Brazil, South Africa. Now, what is really interesting in this is that in these international organisations and committees thereof, it's actually the India, Brazil, South Africa group that is calling the shots. The Chinese are with them sometimes, sometimes not. China has its own play in all of this, but those three, I'm told, are the ones that are, getting in, drafting the resolutions, organising the votes, getting things running their way, and each in its own way has enough clout to change things. India sort of single-handedly torpedoed the last Doha round. Why? Because it could. And it's that kind of exercise of power which I think that we will see. Now, I think, how do we respond to that? You can go with it, or you can compromise your own positions. Some cases we might do that because we can't win anyway, or you can try to get inside that and shape the way it works so that the resolutions and the votes come out in ways that are more agreeable to us. But it's hard work, and very hard work, and we can't assume, as in so many cases we used to be able to assume in the past, that the US and the Western group of countries were going to get their own way. They didn't in Copenhagen, they haven't in the Doha round, and in those esoteric organisations I'm talking about that don't mean anything in Perth, but in the business of macro global economic government, they do matter. So the BRICS and the IBSAs are the one to watch if this is your area of interest.
And from FDI?
I'm just wondering, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and considerations of the post review, do you think we'll see a rise of the defence of Australia, sort of the policy of the 80s and 90s? Will that sort of define defence in the future?
I think it won't be as clear cut as that. I mean, the simple notion is that we became focused on the defence of Australia, which they put in capitals DOA, meaning just protecting ourselves, and that at some time in the late 90s and the first decade of this century we went into more expeditionary international security issues. I don't think it's going to be a simple throwing the switch back to the past at all. We will still see the best defence for Australia being outside Australia, but I think that given our changed demographics, our changed economics, and the other factors I've talked about, we're going to see more defence activity in Australia without simply lapsing back to that. That we won't be ruling out international security ventures if the need arises, though perhaps the need for it will be assessed more rigorously than it was in the past.
Alistair?
I don't want to crystallise the argument in being one or the other. I think the future is a certain amalgam of that.
At the start of your talk, you just talked about how, in your view, the change that's taking place in Asia has been unprecedented since sort of 1820 to 1850 with the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, and that we have not yet seen the, as you said, political transformations or demographic democratic revolutions that took place at that time. And I was just wondering, is that a serious sort of hypothesis that you hold, that these things move together, that economic development necessarily is correlated or occurs at the same time as political change, and hence is an inevitable thing? Because I would have thought that one of the highlights of the sort of the Arab Spring has been that where those sort of quite visceral agitations for political change have taken place has been in situations where those states have been unable to provide an environment for economic growth, and that's agitated the populace to see change.
Well, that is That is a really interesting question, just on the so-called Arab Spring, which I call the Arab Winter of Discontent, because that's what it'll lead to. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that starts with food prices.
Yep.
Food prices, and you can trace this political turmoil up the east coast of Africa, across North Africa, across the Middle East, to India, where it was managed in their own way, into China. The so-called anti-democratic crackdown in China last year was much more about managing responses to food price inflation. Remember, Tiananmen Square was about the economy. It was later portrayed as being about democracy, but it was about the economy. You're right, it was about the economy overheating, inflation getting out of hand, and food prices. And so it was right across Asia. Somebody who was at the Indian Friends at that conference of yours here last year, Sue, was saying every Indian politician knows the price of 4 commodities: lentils, chickpeas, cardamom, something else. And right at that time in August, they were obsessed about the rising price of lentils. And they knew how it was moving every day because it was reflected in unrest in their community. So you're right, that was the sort of politics of not having. Now, in China, there was a view among a lot of Chinese and Chinese commentators that said all China has to do is to provide continuing economic growth, and then its own political system can change slowly and it won't be under any great pressure. And the argument was that China is different, that it doesn't have to go democratic or responsive, and this will work its way through in a Chinese way. What was really, I could see that argument, and at different times might have been persuaded by it, but what is really interesting to me is that the Chinese leadership itself seems to be looking at that whole question. You saw probably what was said by some of the leaders at the National People's Congress meeting earlier this month, when they talked about, Wen Jiabao talked about the importance and urgency of political reform. And I know from others that many think tanks across China are trying to work out what that means. Given that we can't stay where we were, they seem to accept that, just what do we evolve to and how? They're pretty sure it's not going to be one person, one vote, and could you imagine that? The Chinese, steeped in their system, will look around the Western world and they'll see every elected government either in minority or fragile coalition, and not a commentary on Australia, but for the most part not offering the kinds of leadership and government that their communities want, and they say, you want us to be like that? Let's get it, 1.5 billion people, and you want us to be governed like that? Europe, Japan? And no, the answer for them is no, they don't want to be governed like that. But what do they want to be governed at? And these think tanks are trying to work it out, and not only work out what the new model has to be, it has to be a bit responsive to enable the economy to work, but they certainly don't want to go too far to one person, one vote on that. So they start with Confucius. They still maintain the flag of Mao at the front door, but they try to find a solution. What does Confucius say about, what can we draw from Confucius about the model for government? And that's what some of the think tanks are doing. Others are trying to think completely outside the box. They're quite sure that they won't go the way of Japan with its ersatz Western system. They despise that. And as I said, they have little time for Western European styles of government, but what they evolve to, I don't know. Anyway, to answer your question, I might have thought 10 years ago that they don't need political change, but they now seem to be talking about it themselves. So I think it's got a way to go, and you have to be right into the China game to understand where the debate is. Maybe, in the Chinese way, they say some things and it's code for something else, and I'm not close enough anymore to understand what that is. But there is some kind of internal debate going on which suggests they see a need for political change as well. It's a complicated answer, or roundabout one, but it's an open question that will matter more in your lifetime, I think, than mine.
Hi, you mentioned the rapid development of communications technology and infrastructure in Afghanistan. I'm just wondering how that impacts upon the various national identities within Afghanistan and how it affects the ability of other states in the region to have an effect on those national identities, and how transparent those processes are to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think in answer to the last question, that it is happening is pretty transparent, and for the most part, though you have to guess at just what is passing, but the 8 million or whatever it is mobile phones, some say there may be more. Some of them, a good many of them, are in the hands of the Taliban, and some of the remnant of Al-Qaeda, and some in the hands of Haqqani. So, the bad guys have got them as well as the good guys, and they're communicating with their constituencies outside of Afghanistan. The Hazara community, for instance, is communicating with Shiite Muslims in Iran. Nothing happens in Afghanistan that isn't instantly communicated to the community outside of Afghanistan, and similarly the communities inside Afghanistan that are connected to regional countries are immediately in touch with developments there too. So in northern Afghanistan, they're very closely connected with India, and the communication there is intense. If you did a networking diagram of the use of the mobile phones, I imagine you'd see a line from India to northern Afghanistan, you'd see a dense set of lines from Afghanistan into southern Afghanistan, you'd see a line reaching across from Iran into the Hazara communities in the centre there. Yeah, it's very big. It's very, very contemporary world in that sense. And they all have their agendas. You see, as I've travelled to India and Pakistan and Iran, China, elsewhere in the region, said, look, you all have a common interest in a particular outcome in Afghanistan. You have to get Afghanistan into a situation of playing the role that landlocked countries always play. Friend to all, enemy to none, accessible to all, providing some sort of a resource, even a communications route, or a centre that is neutral at which you can communicate. That's the interest you all have in Afghanistan. They say, yeah, except we just want to do this, we just want to make sure the Hazaras are not disadvantaged. We agree with that, we just want to make sure the place is not dominated by the Pushtun. Or we agree with that, but you've got to respect the interests of the Pushtun and make sure they balance the interests of the North, and so on. So the regional countries just have all of their own stakes in Afghanistan, and getting a consensus among them that can stick and be translated into the kind of political solution, immensely difficult. There's a big conference called in Istanbul a year and a half ago, which seemed to set up a regional process. We seemed to be getting Iran to the tent, India eventually came, and so on, and then all sorts of new dynamics emerged in the region as a result, among other things, of the Arab Spring, and as a result of the Iran nuclear issue coming to the top of the agenda, which made the Iranians very skittish, and they all got anxious about the role of Turkey, and so this thing that was seen to be coming together went centrifugal again. The whole endeavour over a number of years in Afghanistan has been to create the environment in which a negotiated settlement can be reached. Mostly, with very few exceptions, insurgencies are settled that way. So what you needed was military force in the right places, applying the right amount of pressure to push them to the table. You needed economic development to try to give some credibility to the Afghan government, to try to give something to the people that differentiated the government of Afghanistan that we were supporting from the Taliban, and you needed a sort of consensus among regional countries about the outcome that was needed. And so the endeavour was to bring all of this together. But at every point something else has happened to change the balance. So the negotiation scenario still exists. Some progress has been made, but the Taliban has stepped back for the moment. I don't think it's the last word on it, but it'll be a hard it'll be a hard negotiation to get to and to win. And one other point, I've strayed from your question, but you can't overlook Afghan politics. Sometimes you see Hamid Karzai as an unsympathetic figure, but he is in the world. He is an elected politician, and he is in the world's most invidious political situation, dependent on foreign forces, but having to carve out some kind of independent position of his own in a very complex and divided political community. And he's constantly on a tightrope and leaning one way or the other. But very, very complex. And the short answer is that the regional countries that you mentioned have all got their stakes and are not changing their approach very much.
My question is in relation to India. With a lot of its domestic problems, just recently the 200 billion coal contracts scandal and all these other issues relating to poverty and so forth, what role do you see India playing on the world stage, and should it play a role with these sort of problems domestically?
As I suggested, I think India is becoming a great economy, but I think that doesn't necessarily make it a great power in terms of influence. I think it will be influential in those international forums in the way that I said, but I think that in a wider strategic sense, India firstly has those kinds of limitations, though China does too, but it manages them differently. And secondly, that India is and is likely to remain very border-centric in its approach to its strategic interests. It's an approach that essentially based on being the dominant power in its own region, which is a not insignificant region, but you can see this in the structure of its armed forces. I think the Army is 22 or 3 times bigger than the Air Force, which is twice as big as the Navy. Now, that's not a force structure for a global power. It's a force structure for a power which is worried about its own borders primarily. And it's not an insignificant region. There's a couple of billion people there and growing. But it doesn't make it a great power in the world at large. My preferred model for India, they probably have a preferred model for Australia in India. My preferred model would be for India to play the kind of economic integrating role for the region, so that South Asia can go the way of East Asia, where you have virtually one integrated economy based on the precept that to enrich my neighbour is to enrich myself. I think sometimes in the subcontinent, when I listen to people, I think they think more in terms of beggar thy neighbour. My neighbour's neighbour is my friend. There's much too much of that, and this comes, of course, to Pakistan. We focus on extremism in Pakistan and political instability, the risk of nuclear stuff. The real issue for Pakistan, to me, is its economic future. There's 180 million plus people, a demographic that says 55% of them are under 18 or something, and an economy that is very, very fragile. Only 2%, less than 2% of its official merchandise trade is with India, one of the fastest growing countries in the world. I mean, this is nonsense. A struggling economy, a foundering economy, bordering a rapidly growing economy, but with negligible trade links between them. Somehow that East Asian model of open economies and integrating has to be developed in South Asia, so that as we can talk of one great East Asian economy, more or less, we can talk of one great South Asian economy. That's the hope. That's the hope, and but I think whether India's leaders see it that way or are able to move that way because of their own intensely democratic structure is a question. I hope they can.